Almost 600 days ago, the Chinese dictatorship kidnapped two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Justin Trudeau hasn't done anything about it. In fact, he continues to send foreign aid to China, even sending our entire national stockpile of face masks and other personal protective equipment to China for free in the middle of the pandemic. He really is their poodle.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China. Because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime.
The two Michaels weren't captured in a legal arrest. They were held for the first year and a half without even being charged with a crime. They're being held in brutal conditions in a room where the lights are never turned off. That's a form of torture. They're being denied visits from Canadian diplomats. China has been crystal clear about what they're doing. They're taking hostages. That's not what G20 countries do. That's what terrorists or pirates or criminals do. Communist China is acting like a rogue country, like gangsters. That dictatorship may be producing your high-tech cell phones and computers, but it is still a dictatorship. It still has that 1970s Mao Zedong thuggery in it. They're not even trying to hide it. Chinese dictators repeatedly admit that these two Canadians were seized as a bargaining chip to force the release of an accused Chinese criminal in Canada. Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of the huge Chinese tech company called Huawei, she was arrested in Vancouver and is being extradited to the US to face charges of fraud. Meng, of course, is out on bail. She's living the high life in Vancouver, a wonderful city where she's free to go out and about, and has the very best lawyers that her billions can buy. So far, she's lost her first round in court. A fair judge in an independent legal system said that the extradition hearing can proceed. But the Chinese dictators want her sprung out of jail before the trial is even over. It's a tit for tat, say the Chinese. It's an admission that the two Michaels didn't do anything wrong. They're just hostages, bargaining chips. So what have we done as a country in response to this barbaric behavior by China? This is hostage-taking, kidnapping. Have we kicked out Chinese diplomats in protest? Have we sent home some of the thousands of children of corrupt Communist Party of China officials who send their kids to attend Canadian universities, taking up spaces otherwise available to Canadian citizens? Have we kicked them out? Have we put any tariffs on Chinese imported goods? Have we even just used our words to condemn them? No, 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 and no. The opposite, actually. We are completely compliant and submissive. Trudeau is even giving more foreign aid to China, including a bizarre financial grant to the Wuhan virology lab. I'm not kidding. Is there nothing China can do that Trudeau won't just shrug off? It's humiliating, of course. It's un-Canadian. And most importantly, it's not working. It's not getting the two Michaels back. In fact, the Chinese fake legal system, it's all predetermined by the Communist Party over there. They've ratcheted up the propaganda war, recently charging the two Michaels with spying. It's world news. Here's the BBC story, and yet, still, Trudeau does nothing. No sanctions, no diplomatic expulsions, so nothing. It'll soon be 600 days in prison. So we've got an idea. There's a great Canadian human rights law scholar. He used to teach constitutional law. He's been a lawyer. And most importantly for our purposes, he championed the case of the Falun Gong, who were persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. He worked with a member of parliament named David Kilgour to investigate and expose China's horrific practice of forcibly harvesting human organs from live prisoners, including Falun Gong political prisoners. They would cut those organs out of people and sell them to China's Communist Party officials or even foreign buyers. David Matas is the name of the lawyer who exposed that and who told the world. Well, we've asked Professor Matas, who knows about China and Chinese prisons and human rights law in the UN, we asked him what we could possibly do to help the two Michaels. What we could do. I mean, we're not in government, we're just citizens who wish something would be done. Well, Matas had an idea. Here, watch my recent interview with him. Professor, based on your work scrutinizing China, your lifelong dedication to civil rights, and your interest in Canadian politics, our mutual friend, our lawyer, Aaron Rosenberg, reached out to you to discuss how we could perhaps work with you on the troubling case of the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have been in illegal detention in China for a year and a half. Can you explain to our viewers what legal steps you think we can take, given that we don't have standing as the family or the two men, given that we're not the government of Canada, and given that China is in some ways a rogue state? What could we do legally about what is really a hostage taking?
The opportunities for dealing legally with Chinese violations of international human rights standards is relatively limited because China is not a signatory to most human rights, or to many human rights treaties. And the ones where it does sign on to, like the Convention Against Torture, it tends to not sign on to the optional complaints mechanisms or the international legal disputes mechanisms. There are some recourses nonetheless, and a couple of those are through the, or several of those are through the United Nations Human Rights Council thematic mechanisms. What the United Nations Human Rights Council has done is set up a number of thematic mechanisms, rapporteurs, working groups dealing with specific human rights issues. There's a rapporteur on torture, there's a working group on disappearances, there's a working group on arbitrary detention, and so on, and there's dozens of them. And these thematic mechanisms, they're not treaty-based, they're just council-based, and so they have jurisdiction over the whole world, including China. And there's no agreement necessary from states of the United Nations for these mechanisms to deal with human rights in those countries. And so these mechanisms can and have in the past dealt with China. And I was dealing, for instance, with the UN rapporteur on torture and the UN rapporteur on religious intolerance about this issue of organ transplant abuse in Falun Gong, and also with the UN Committee Against Torture, because China is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture, also with the Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council, because the Universal Periodic Review, as the name indicates, is universal, and China comes up for review every few years, and then any state can raise any human rights concern it wants during the Universal Periodic Review. When it comes to the Universal Periodic Review or the Convention Against Torture, we are dealing with periodicity. We are dealing with events which occur every so often. But when it comes to the thematic mechanisms, they're continuously functioning. They report to the Human Rights Council every year, and they can take complaints at any time or petitions. Now, these human rights mechanisms do have complaints or petition options, and the petitions are open to everybody. They're open to states, they're open to NGOs, and of course they're open to the victims and their families. But the consent is not necessary of the families or the victims. I mean, obviously, in some situations, the consent of the victims is impossible, where they're disappeared or maybe arbitrarily executed, and the families may be intimidated, which is often the case in China, where the Communist Party makes a point of not just intimidating their target, but everybody in their network to try to get at their target, and so often the only available recourse, which is true really of my dealing with Falun Gong, is an outsider who has no connection to China and no point of pressure. I mean, I'm not going to lose any business with China by doing this sort of thing, because I don't have any business with China, and so that's the system. It is a system of complaint or petition by NGOs or somebody like Rebel News. They can make such a complaint or petition, and then the thematic mechanism will deal with it.
Well,
now,
Professor, we would like to do that, because we, like so many Canadians and others around the world, have watched what we perceive to be inaction on the part of the Canadian government. There's the odd, gentle statement, but there's been no diplomatic repercussions, no sanctions, no deported diplomats, no trade, consequences. I think that the fact that those two men are still in detention a year and a half later says everything we need to know. Now, I want to tell our viewers that you did take steps to reach out to the family to get their thoughts on this process, to invite them to participate, to invite them to receive updates. What have you heard back, if anything, from the families after you emailed and reached out to them about our proposed steps?
Well, yes, that's true. There was a communication to the families because we did have contact information telling that Rebel News was planning to do this, that we would keep them in touch. We wanted to inform them. We invited them to participate if they wanted to participate. We haven't heard back from them since. The communication is relatively recent, so I don't know if that tells us anything yet, because very often people are slow in communications, and also I assume they get a lot of stuff. But in any case, we're giving them an option of something they may want to do, but they don't have to answer, and their non-answer is there is no requirement for them to answer for the UN system to become engaged.
And I can imagine that given the thing they care about most, these people are still in grave jeopardy. They I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, they most likely would not want to be seen as being personally antagonistic to the government of China. So even if they were to reply, it would be under a form of duress. It would almost be like asking a hostage, do you want us to help? I mean, but I'm glad you did reach out to them, and of course keep us posted what they say. Tell our viewers, what would the form of a complaint be? You mentioned that there are these thematic groups at the UN Human Rights Council. Would it be the form of a letter? Is it a formal application, a formal report? What would it look like, what you would prepare as a lawyer? You would refer to certain principles and bring facts to the attention of the UN? Is it just a letter?
The UN website actually tells you what they want, and they ask for specific types of information. Obviously, what they want is as much detail as possible, because often the problem is that when people make complaints, it's difficult to know exactly what they're talking about. So names, dates, times, places, as much detail about the specific violation as you could possibly get. They'd be interested in exhaustion of remedies, not in terms of Canada, but in terms of China, like what has been done or could be done in China to alleviate the plight of these people. They'd be interested in other remedies that are being sought that might be useful either in the UN system or anywhere else around the world. They'd be interested in how the particular complaint fits within the mandate of the theme mechanism to which the complaint is being addressed. Those are the sorts of things that the complaint would address.
I have a question for you, and it would touch on anything at the United Nations. China is very influential at the UN. It runs 4 agencies and effectively controls a 5th. We saw their interference recently with the World Health Organization. What is the ability of China simply to veto or crush or shut down or summarily dismiss something that criticizes it? Because the UN is not friendly to democratic activists who ask pesky questions like you will do. What do you think China will do in reaction to our legal complaint?
Well, as I said, typically what happens with these complaints is that the rapporteur will send the complaint to the foreign government for response, and then in the report afterwards, typically what happens is that the rapporteur will put in the complaint, or report on the complaint and report on the response, and may draw some concluding, or may draw some observations based on it. And my experience is, at least with some of the other times I've dealt with the system, is the exercise is useful, even if when you're dealing with China, what you get back is nonsense. Because if I were to write to the government of China directly and say, I don't like what you're doing with the two Michaels, they'd probably just ignore it. But with the UN system, though they may generate nonsense in response, they feel they can't ignore it, so they will reply. And a nonsensical reply from the government of China serves its own purpose, because it becomes possible to point out how nonsensical it is. And so, for instance, with this organ transplant abuse, we were concerned about, the government of China was saying, look at, they were boasting, look at how big our transplant numbers are, trying to show they're technologically ahead in transplants. And so then the UN rapporteur said, well, okay, you've got these big transplant numbers, where do the organs come from? And the response to that was, we never said our transplant numbers were big, which of course they had said, and it was posted on their internet sites at the same time as they were denying they said it. So, I mean, it was just such obvious nonsense that it became another point of attack. So I would say that exercise, obviously didn't stop the abuse, and it still continues. It just added to the weight of the argument that we had and gave us an additional reason why our position was strong. Because, I mean, if the government of China, in response to a well-reasoned argument, can answer only nonsense, it must be that they don't have a good answer if all they can give is a bad answer.
Huh. Well, so that's the goal here, is to write a complaint that properly marshals the facts and the law and shows what China's doing, and at the very least compel them to give, I guess it's like question period in Parliament that way. You don't really get a good answer most of the time, but sometimes the absurdity of the answer is telling in itself. So that's our goal here. Write a letter to bring attention to this and smoke out China's answers, and maybe use those to contradict China or to show how unlawful they are. That's our goal. Is that correct?
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, I think question period is a good analogy. I don't mean to suggest that the government is anything like the government of China, but otherwise I think it's a good analogy.
Well, what do you think? The plan is simple and small, but I think it's better than zero, better than nothing, Trudeau's approach. Draft a formal complaint about how the two Michaels are being mistreated by China. File it with the special rapporteurs at the UN's Human Rights Council. Make China answer it, and use their answer politically and diplomatically to name and shame China as breaking international law, breaking international norms. They hate that. They don't like losing face. We have a few other ideas too, but the main thing is to do something that the world will at least see and hear, not the total silent surrender that Trudeau is doing. Will this free the two Michaels? Probably not. Will it bring their plight to a wider audience? You bet it will. Will we hopefully spur actual politicians to do something more, maybe even to take over this project? I hope so. In any event, we're just going to do it. I just feel like we have to. If you want to help, please do. We're paying Professor Matus' fee for his legal work. We'll file a complaint when it's ready, which should be soon. And when the time is right, we will actually go to Geneva, Switzerland, where the UN Human Rights Council is, and maybe make a bit of a fuss about this too. I do need your help, please. I've signed a retainer agreement with Professor Matus to cover his fees and his travel costs if we go to Geneva. If you think this is a good idea, please help me out by going to freethe2michaels.com, freethe2michaels.com. I will post updates at that website when the legal complaint is ready. We'll publish the legal complaint itself. You can read it for yourself. And all of our follow-up work, including hopefully the trip to Geneva itself. This is a small step, but that's more than anything Trudeau has done. If you believe in standing up to China and calling out their bullying and standing up for Canadian citizens, please go to freethe2michaels.com and lend a hand. Thanks. Justin Trudeau doesn't seem to be doing a thing to bring back the two Michaels kidnapped by communist China. We've hired a top law professor to file a formal human rights complaint to the United Nations. To learn more about it, to see the complaint, and to help us pay that lawyer's fee, please go to freethetwomichaels.com.